A lone samurai stands silent under a cold, full moon. We picture him bound by honor, guided by an ancient, unshakable code. But what if that code is a beautiful lie? This journey uncovers the forgotten history of Bushido, a story not of a single scroll but of a constantly changing ideal, shaped by politics, philosophy, and hidden influences. By the end, you will understand the true, complex legacy of the samurai, stripped of modern myth. We will explore how a code of death was born in an era of peace and why the most loyal warriors sometimes chose betrayal. What does the word honor truly mean to you? Our modern vision of the samurai is polished to a brilliant, romantic sheen. We see a stoic warrior bound by an unwavering moral compass, his every action dictated by a sacred, ancient text. This powerful image is everywhere, from epic Hollywood films to beloved anime series. Yet this noble figure is largely a fiction, a beautiful painting layered over a much more complicated canvas. The historical reality of the samurai is riddled with contradictions that this myth carefully smooths over. These were men who swore loyalty to their lords, yet history is filled with tales of breathtaking betrayals and shifting alliances for personal power. They were warriors who supposedly valued honor above life itself, but their daily existence could also involve brutal political maneuvering and financial concerns far from the battlefield. The greatest misconception of all is the idea of Bushido itself. We are taught to imagine it as a single, unchanging code, carved in stone centuries ago and passed down perfectly through the generations. The truth is far more dynamic. Bushido was not a fixed set of rules. It was an evolving set of ideals, a philosophy that was constantly being rewritten and reinterpreted across different eras. It was shaped by the needs of the time, influenced by new schools of thought, and often molded to serve the political aims of those in power. So how did this fluid, practical guide for a warrior class become the rigid, spiritual code we think of today? The answer lies not on the battlefield, but in an unexpected era of enforced peace. To find the origins of the samurai spirit, we must travel back to a time before the code had a name. Centuries before the age of the katana and the solemn ritual of seppuku, the first samurai were emerging. They were not yet the philosopher warriors of legend. They were the bushi, a class of professional warriors whose world was one of raw, practical necessity. Picture a man on horseback, clad in functional armor, his primary weapon not a sword but a powerful bow. His identity was rooted in land and local power, not in abstract ideals. He served a lord, yes, but that loyalty was often a personal bond, a transaction of military service for protection and grants of land. In this tumultuous era, concepts like honor and duty were not written in a sacred text. They were fluid, personal agreements as changeable as the political winds. A bushi's primary driver was not philosophical purity, but survival and political gain for his clan. His allegiance could shift if a more powerful or lucrative offer appeared. This was not seen as disgraceful in the way we might think today. It was a calculated move in a dangerous game where the ultimate prize was stability and influence. The idea of a universal, unwavering code of conduct would have seemed strange to these early warriors. Their honor was a personal possession, defined by their success in protecting their lands, expanding their influence, and providing for their families. It was a world where the sharp, practical realities of the bow and the spear came long before the refined philosophies of the sword. This world of shifting personal loyalties could not last forever. A great change was brewing, one that would begin to forge those loose warrior bonds into something resembling a code. That change arrived with the rise of the Kamakura shogunate. For the first time, a single military government, led by a supreme commander known as the shogun, established its authority over all of Japan. This was a seismic shift in power. The shogun now stood above the countless regional lords, and the samurai who served those lords now answered to a higher, centralized authority. This new structure created an urgent and practical problem. How do you control a nation of powerful, independent-minded warriors? You cannot have every samurai following his own personal definition of honor, making alliances and breaking them based on local feuds or financial temptation. The entire system would collapse into chaos. Stability for the shogunate became the ultimate goal, and to achieve stability, they needed to impose order on the warrior class itself. The solution was to start formalizing conduct. The shogunate began to promote a more standardized set of expectations for the samurai. This was not yet the philosophical Bushido we know today. It was a practical framework designed for governance. Loyalty was emphasized, but now it was loyalty to the shogunate and the state system, not just to a single local lord. Duty, discipline, and martial prowess were all channeled into serving the new military hierarchy. Think of it not as the birth of a spiritual path, but as the creation of an employee handbook for the entire warrior class. The shogunate needed its soldiers to be predictable, reliable, and above all, obedient to the chain of command that now ended at its own doorstep. This was the crucial first step in transforming the samurai from a collection of independent fighters into a cohesive, governable class. But this system of control, built for a society constantly on the verge of war, would soon face its greatest test. What happens to a warrior class when the wars finally end? The shogunate's new order gave the samurai a structure, but it could not answer the deeper questions of a warrior's soul. As the centuries turned, a profound spiritual influence began to seep into the halls of power and the minds of the warrior class. This was the arrival of Zen Buddhism. Zen did not arrive with grand pronouncements or complex theology. Instead, it offered something intensely practical to a man who lived by the sword. Its core principles resonated with a chilling clarity. Zen emphasized absolute mental discipline, a state of mindfulness where the chaotic noise of the world, even the primal fear of death, could be silenced. For a samurai, this was not just philosophy, it was a survival skill. The practice of zazen, or seated meditation, trained the mind to remain calm and focused amidst chaos. It taught a warrior to act without hesitation, to see the decisive moment without being clouded by doubt or emotion. This mental state was known as mushin, a mind of no mind. In battle, a moment of hesitation could mean death. A flicker of fear could break a perfect strike. Zen offered a way to transcend that, to become a vessel of pure, unthinking action. But its most profound gift was its perspective on mortality. Zen taught that life and death were two sides of the same reality, an endless cycle to be accepted without attachment or dread. For a warrior whose profession placed him constantly on the edge of oblivion, this was a revolutionary comfort. The fear of death was a chain that could bind a fighter, making him slow and cautious. By learning to let go of that fear, to look at his own end with a detached acceptance, a samurai could achieve a terrifying form of freedom. He could walk into battle with a tranquil heart, not because he was unfeeling, but because he had made peace with the inevitable. This spiritual backbone began to transform the very identity of the elite samurai. He was no longer just a skilled fighter, a bushi defined by his bow and his land. He was becoming a philosophical soldier, a man who sought mastery over his own mind with the same intensity he sought mastery of the sword. The ideals of discipline and fearless acceptance promoted by Zen would later become fundamental threads in the fabric of Bushido, providing a profound justification for the ultimate act of loyalty. But this spiritual evolution was happening in a world still defined by the sword. What happens when these philosophical warriors are suddenly told they are no longer needed for war? Yet this spiritual focus on the inner self needed an ethical framework to guide a warrior's actions in the world. That structure arrived not from the meditation halls, but from the scholarly study of texts with the widespread adoption of Confucian philosophy. While Zen shaped the samurai's mind, Confucianism built his moral skeleton. Imported from China, this system of thought provided the precise social blueprint that a growing military government desperately needed. Its core principles became the invisible pillars supporting the entire samurai edifice. Confucianism emphasized a rigid, harmonious social hierarchy where everyone knew their place and their duties. For the samurai, this meant absolute loyalty to one's lord, a virtue known as chu. It also championed filial piety, the unwavering devotion to one's parents and ancestors. These were not just suggestions, they were the fundamental obligations that held society together. A samurai was now ethically bound in two directions, vertically to his master and horizontally to his family line. This created a powerful and often painful tension. What was a warrior to do if his lord commanded him to act against his family's well-being or against his own moral conscience? The code demanded absolute obedience, yet a man still had to live with his own choices. This was the central conflict woven into the samurai's existence, a silent war between duty and personal virtue. A famous legend tells of a loyal retainer ordered to kill the innocent child of his lord's rival. His Confucian duty demanded he obey without question. Yet his own humanity screamed in protest. These stories were so popular because they dramatized the very real ethical dilemmas samurai faced, trapped between the absolute demands of loyalty and the quiet voice of their own judgment. Confucianism provided the why for the samurai's ultimate sacrifice, but it also laid the groundwork for his deepest internal struggles. But beneath the disciplined mind of Zen and the rigid social order of Confucianism flowed a deeper, older current. This was the indigenous heart of Japan, the spiritual tradition of Shinto. While Zen offered mental clarity and Confucianism provided ethical rules, Shinto gave the samurai his soul's native landscape. It infused the warrior's code with a profound, almost tangible connection to the natural world. In Shinto, the divine was not a distant, singular god, but a vibrant multitude of spirits known as kami. These kami resided in everything from an ancient, gnarled tree and a cascading waterfall to a simple, weathered stone. The world itself was alive, sacred, and charged with a spiritual energy. For a samurai, this meant his entire environment was a reflection of the divine. The mountain where he trained was not just rock and soil, it was the body of a spirit. The forge where his sword was crafted was a sacred space, its fire a living kami. This worldview fostered a unique reverence. A warrior did not merely wield his katana, he cared for it as a sacred object, a vessel that might itself house a spiritual presence. His relationship with his horse, his armor, even the ground he walked on, was tinged with this spiritual respect. This connection extended beyond the physical world into the realm of the ancestors. Shinto placed immense importance on the veneration of the dead, who were seen as protective family kami. A samurai's actions were never just his own, they were a link in an unbroken chain stretching back through generations. To bring dishonor upon himself was to stain the memory of his ancestors and jeopardize the spiritual well-being of his entire lineage. His life was an offering to those who came before him, and his death would see him join their ranks, watching over his descendants. This belief gave his struggles a cosmic weight, anchoring his sense of duty in something far older and more personal than any philosophical doctrine. The Shinto emphasis on purity and cleansing rituals also deeply shaped the samurai's daily life and his view of death. Before a battle or an important ceremony, a warrior would perform misogi, ritual purification with water. This was not about washing away physical dirt, but about cleansing the spirit of kegare or spiritual pollution. Kegare could come from contact with death, from moral transgression, or from negative emotions. A polluted spirit was weak, clouded, and vulnerable. To face a challenge with a pure heart and a clear mind was to align oneself with the natural order of the kami. This concept made the samurai's final act, seppuku, appear in a different light. while Confucianism framed it as the ultimate expression of loyalty, and Zen provided the mental fortitude to carry it out. Shinto offered a spiritual interpretation. In this context, a ritual suicide could be seen as the ultimate act of purification. By spilling his own blood, a disgraced warrior was cleansing the profound kegare of his failure, restoring spiritual harmony for his lord, his family, and his ancestors. It was a terrible, final way to wash away dishonor and rejoin the natural and spiritual order from which he had fallen. So the samurai stood at a crossroads of three powerful traditions, his spirit shaped by the native earth of Shinto, his mind honed by Zen, and his place in society defined by Confucianism. But how did these disparate threads finally weave together into the single, powerful tapestry we now call Bushido? The answer lies in an era of unprecedented peace, where the warrior was forced to reinvent his very reason for being. For centuries, these spiritual and philosophical ideas floated in the air, waiting for a story to give them a human face. That story arrived not as a dry military manual, but as a sweeping epic, chanted by blind monks to the haunting strum of a biwa lute. The Tale of the Hike is not a history book, it is a monumental work of literature that performed a crucial act of cultural alchemy. It took the raw, often messy realities of samurai life and forged them into powerful, tragic archetypes. The epic chronicles the monumental Genpei War, the great civil war that saw the Terra clan rise to unbelievable heights of power, only to be utterly destroyed by the rival Minamoto. But its true purpose was not to record events with cold accuracy. It was propaganda and moral instruction disguised as a thrilling saga. The opening line set this tone perfectly, a somber Buddhist reminder of the impermanence of all things. The proud do not endure, they are like a dream on a spring night. The mighty fall at last, they are as dust before the wind. This was the core lesson. The tale was designed to show the consequences of arrogance and the sublime beauty of loyalty, even in the face of certain doom. The hike did not document an existing code of honor. It actively invented one by presenting a model of how a perfect warrior should think, act, and die. It created the archetype of the tragic hero. Consider the story of Terra no Atsumori, a young, refined nobleman of the Terra clan. During the final battle, he is pursued by a seasoned Minamoto warrior named Kumagai no Nayazane. Kumagai corners the young man, ready to strike him down, but as he forces Atsumori's helmet off, he does not see an enemy soldier. He sees a boy of 16 with a delicately powdered face, just the same age as his own son. In that moment, Kumagai is torn between his duty as a warrior and his compassion as a human being. He hesitates, but the brutal logic of war demands the kill. He takes Atsumori's head, but the act shatters him, leading him to later renounce the world and become a monk. This single story, whether true or not, became a cultural touchstone. It was not celebrating victory, it was glorifying a specific kind of loss, one filled with beauty, poetry, and moral complexity. It planted the idea that the greatest warrior was not necessarily the one who won, but the one whose death was the most poignant, whose loyalty was the most absolute. The tale is filled with such moments, with warriors composing final poems before throwing themselves into battle, or choosing to die alongside their fallen lord rather than live in a world without him. These narratives were consumed by samurai for generations. They were not just entertainment, they were a form of ethical training. They answered the question, what does a good samurai look like? He looks like Atsumori, refined and brave. He acts like Kumagai, tormented by the humanity of his enemy. This was the seed of a formal code, crystallizing the virtues of loyalty, courage, and an almost aesthetic appreciation for a noble death. But these were still just stories, beautiful and tragic myths. The real, hard power of turning these myths into a governing doctrine for an entire class would require a very different kind of pen, one wielded not by a poet, but by a ruler who needed to control an army with no wars left to fight. So where do we find this single, sacred text of Bushido, the one document that laid out the rules for every samurai? The startling truth is it never existed. For most of samurai history, there was no official handbook, no central scroll that every warrior was given and sworn to uphold. The code was not written in ink but carried in the air, passed from father to son, from lord to retainer, in an unbroken chain of spoken wisdom. It was a living, breathing oral tradition, a collection of unwritten rules and family precepts that could change dramatically from one castle town to the next. Your clan's version of honor might look very different from the clan in the next valley. One family might prioritize unflinching loyalty to the death, while another might teach that strategic retreat to fight another day was the wiser path. This was not a failure of the system, it was the system. Bushido was a deeply personal and practical guide, shaped by generations of local experience. It was built on what worked for survival and success in that specific region, under that specific family's leadership. A young samurai learned his duty not by reading a philosophy book, but by watching his elders, by listening to stories of his ancestors' victories and their costly mistakes. He absorbed the code through his skin, through the subtle corrections of a fencing master, through the tales told around the evening fire. This is why the historical record is so messy and full of contradictions. A samurai's choices were guided by a complex web of obligations. His jiri, which included his duty to his lord, his duty to his family name, and his own personal sense of honor. There was no single authority to appeal to when these duties clashed. He had to weigh them in the moment, guided by the unwritten lessons of his lineage. How could such a fluid and personal code ever become the rigid, universal ideal we recognize today? The transformation would require a pen and a man with a very specific political need. The long civil wars finally ended. In the early 17th century, a brilliant and ruthless shogun named Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan, slamming the door on centuries of conflict. He established a rigid, centralized government in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and enforced a peace so absolute it would last for 250 years. This was the Tokugawa Pax, the Great Peace, and for the samurai it was a catastrophe. What is a warrior without a war? The very foundation of their identity, their reason for being, had been ripped away. They were now a class of soldiers permanently stationed in barracks with no battles to fight. The shogunate, terrified of a return to chaos, imposed strict laws that made rebellion nearly impossible. Swords stayed in their scabbards, armor gathered dust. The samurai were transformed from battlefield commanders into glorified bureaucrats, tax collectors, and administrators. They were paid a stipend of rice to sit at a desk and push paper, their legendary martial skills becoming little more than a performance for annual ceremonies. This idleness created a deep and profound identity crisis. A class built for war was now living in a world that had no use for its core function. How could they justify their high social status, their government stipends, if they were no longer protecting anyone? The answer was not to be found on a training ground, but in a library. To prove their continued value to society, the samurai turned inward. They began to philosophize, to codify, to write down the warrior ethos that had once been passed along through action. This was the true birth of Bushido as a written doctrine. Men who had never seen a real battle began writing elaborate treatises on the way of the warrior. The most famous of these was Yamamoto Tsunetomo, a samurai who served a lord and then retired to become a hermit. He never fought in a war. His entire experience of the samurai life was during the Great Peace. Yet his book, the Hagakure, became one of the most influential texts on Bushido. It is filled with a desperate, almost romantic yearning for a warrior past he never knew. He famously wrote that Bushido is found in dying. It is a philosophy of death, a glorification of the ultimate sacrifice, precisely because in a time of peace, that was the one thing a samurai could still theoretically control. A code was no longer a set of practical battlefield guidelines. It became an abstract spiritual ideal, a way to maintain a warrior's pride when there were no wars left to win. This was not an organic evolution. It was a conscious act of self-preservation, an attempt to build a new identity out of ink and memory. But in creating this new philosophical warrior, the samurai class was unknowingly crafting a powerful tool that would soon be used for a very different purpose. Into this intellectual void stepped a scholar named Yamaga Soko. Living in the heart of the 17th century Great Peace, he looked upon the idle samurai class and saw a crisis of purpose. Where others saw bureaucrats, Yamaga envisioned a new kind of warrior, one whose battlefield was not a bloody plain, but the very soul of society. His writings would perform a remarkable act of reinvention, transforming the samurai from a military relic into a permanent moral guardian. He argued that the samurai's true function was not merely to fight, but to serve as a living example of virtue for all other classes. The farmer who grew the rice, the artisan who crafted the goods, the merchant who traded them, all these people were essential, but they were also preoccupied with their specific, profit-driven tasks. They did not have the time or the elevated position to dedicate themselves to pure moral cultivation. This, Yamaga declared, was the samurai's sacred duty. He was to be a full-time ethical specialist. While others worked with their hands, the samurai would work on his character. His entire life, from his daily conduct to his deepest thoughts, was to be a model of righteousness for everyone else to emulate. This was a revolutionary justification for the samurai's continued existence and his government stipend. He was no longer paid to fight, he was paid to be good. Yamaga's philosophy gave the warrior a new sword, one made not of steel but of Confucian virtue. He meticulously defined the qualities this moral exemplar must possess. Above all was a fierce and unwavering loyalty to his lord, a loyalty so profound it made personal gain or comfort meaningless. He was to be courageous, not just in physical combat, but in his dedication to truth. He was to be courteous, honest, and live a life of frugal simplicity, free from the corrupting influence of merchant wealth. In Yamaga's vision, the samurai's mind was his most important weapon, and it required constant training through study, reflection, and self-discipline. This was the first time anyone had so explicitly and systematically laid out the samurai's role as the ethical backbone of the nation. Yamaga Soko did not discover Bushido, he essentially invented it as a coherent philosophy. He took the scattered threads of Zen mindfulness, Shinto reverence, and Confucian duty and wove them into a single, powerful identity for a class that had lost its way. He gave them a new war to fight, a war against moral decay, and in doing so, he provided the intellectual blueprint for the code as the world would come to know it. Yet this lofty new purpose, this life dedicated to being a perfect example, created an impossible standard to live by. What happens when a human being is told he must become a flawless symbol of virtue? And so we arrive at the most famous and most misunderstood book on the samurai way. The Hagakure, or Hidden Among the Leaves, was not a product of the Warring States era, but a creation of the Long Peace. Its author, Yamamoto Tsunetomo, was a retired samurai who had never drawn his sword in actual combat. His entire life was spent in the quiet, stable world of the Tokugawa shogunate, a world he found spiritually suffocating. The Hagakure is not a manual for living warriors. It is a ghost's lament for a glorious past that had already vanished. Its most infamous line echoes across the centuries. The way of the samurai is found in death. When faced with a choice between life and death, simply choose death. It sounds like a brutal, nihilistic command, a glorification of suicide. But in the context of Tsunetomo's time, it takes on a different, more desperate meaning. For a class of warriors with no wars to fight, what was the ultimate act of loyalty they could still perform? They could be willing to die. The willingness itself became the proof of their commitment, the one warrior virtue they could cultivate without a battlefield. The Hagakure is filled with these kinds of extreme, almost romantic pronounctions. It praises a fanatical, unquestioning loyalty that borders on the absurd. In one story, a retainer accidentally causes his lord's prized hawk to fly away. Without a moment's hesitation, the retainer commits seppuku to atone for his careless mistake. For Tsunetomo, this was not a tragedy but the highest form of purity. It was a man proving his devotion was more important than his life, and certainly more important than a simple, logical assessment of the situation. This was a radical, nostalgic interpretation of warrior values, a direct reaction to the bureaucratic reality he saw around him. He watched samurai become comfortable civil servants, arguing over rice stipends and office politics, and he was horrified. The Hagakure was his protest, a scream against the slow, quiet death of the warrior spirit. He was not documenting a universal code that all samurai followed. He was prescribing an impossible ideal, a form of spiritual extremism meant to shock his contemporaries out of their complacency. Think of it as a deeply philosophical, but also deeply impractical, reaction to a midlife crisis for an entire social class. It was a beautiful, dangerous fantasy of what a samurai should have been, written by a man who never got to be one. So why did this obscure, radical text become so famous centuries later? Its journey from a secret teaching to a national symbol would be the final and most tragic twist in the story of the samurai code. While the Hagakure dreamed of a glorious death, another legendary voice offered a philosophy built entirely on winning the fight. Miyamoto Musashi, perhaps Japan's most famous swordsman, lived the violent life that Yamamoto Tsunetomo could only write about. A wandering duelist from the age of 13, Musashi fought and won over 60 life or death contests, many of them against multiple opponents. His final work, The Book of Five Rings, stands in stark contrast to the Hagakure's romanticism. It is a cold, direct, and devastatingly practical guide to strategy. Where the Hagakure is a lament for a lost world, Musashi's book is a masterclass in how to dominate the one you are in. He cared nothing for poetic death. His entire focus was on combat effectiveness and decisive victory. His philosophy was not about finding meaning in dying, but about mastering the path to living through your next encounter. Musashi represents a completely different strand of the samurai spirit, one rooted in the harsh realities of the battlefield rather than the quiet desperation of the bureaucrat's office. The core of his teaching is the ruthless perception of the true nature of things. He instructs his reader to look at a situation without illusion, without emotion, and without preconceived notions. Do not see an honorable opponent, see a collection of openings and weaknesses. Do not think of your sword as a sacred object, think of it as a tool with a specific function. This is a mindset stripped of all spiritual ornamentation, focused purely on the mechanics of winning. He breaks down combat into the rhythm of timing, the advantage of position, and the psychology of your adversary. His famous two-sword style was not just a physical technique, it was a manifestation of this adaptable, overwhelming approach to any conflict. For Musashi, the ultimate goal was not a beautiful death, but an unshakable mental discipline that allowed for perfect action in any moment. He called this understanding the way, a state where you perceive the rhythm of any situation and can act without a single wasted motion or a single moment of hesitation. This is a far cry from the Hagakure's command to simply choose death. Musashi would argue that such a fixed, singular mindset is a fatal weakness. A true strategist must be fluid like water, able to adapt to any terrain and overcome any obstacle. His book is filled with pragmatic advice that feels timeless, applicable to a business negotiation or a personal challenge as much as a sword fight. He warns against habitual routines that an opponent can predict. He emphasizes the importance of knowing the smallest details of your craft, from the terrain under your feet to the look in your enemy's eyes. While the Hagakure glorified a fanatical loyalty that ended in self-destruction, Musashi's work champions a fierce self-reliance aimed at total victory. So we have two competing visions of the samurai soul, one born from the peaceful studies of a retired retainer, the other forged in the dust of 60 duels. One finds purity in the willingness to die, the other finds mastery in the strategy for living. Which of these represents the true Bushido? The answer is that both do, and neither does alone. The samurai code was always this complex, a spectrum of ideals from the spiritual to the savagely practical. But the story of how these ancient texts were rediscovered and used centuries later would reshape the entire world's understanding of Japan. This absolute loyalty, this chugi, was not always a noble force. It held a dark and terrible potential, a willingness to follow orders into moral darkness. The same virtue that could inspire a man to die for his lord could also command him to kill for him, even when the act defied every instinct of his own humanity. Samurai were not just warriors in grand battles, they were the enforcement arm of a rigid social order, and their duty often required them to suppress those with no power to fight back. Consider the peasant revolts that periodically erupted across Japan. These were not armies of rival samurai, but desperate farmers pushed to the brink by famine or crippling taxes. When they dared to rise up, it was the local samurai who were dispatched to crush them. The orders were clear and brutal: restore order by any means necessary. For a warrior, this was a profoundly dishonorable conflict. There was no glory in cutting down unarmed, starving men and women. There was only the grim, bloody work of slaughter, justified by the absolute demand of loyalty to the lord who gave the command. How does a man reconcile his sense of honor with the act of murdering peasants in a field? The code provided a chilling answer: his personal feelings were irrelevant. His jury, his duty to his lord, erased all other considerations. His humanity was a luxury he could not afford if it conflicted with his loyalty. This moral conflict reached its most harrowing form in the elimination of rival families. A lord might decree that an entire lineage, down to the last infant, was a threat that must be erased. The samurai were then tasked with this horrific mission. They would surround a rival's estate, not to engage in honorable combat, but to systematically exterminate every living soul within. They were expected to show no mercy, to offer no quarter. A samurai might be forced to tear a child from its mother's arms, knowing his sword would end both their lives moments later. In that terrible instant, he was caught between the two greatest pillars of his own code. His duty to his lord demanded he kill. Yet his duty to his family, his own filial piety, must have screamed at the atrocity of destroying another. This was the ultimate perversion of the warrior's path, where the very virtue of loyalty became a weapon for atrocity. It reveals the code's most frightening aspect. Bushido was not inherently good or evil. It was a tool, and its moral character depended entirely on the hand that wielded it. A tool of absolute loyalty in the hands of a ruthless master could demand actions that stripped a warrior of his own soul, leaving only the hollow shell of a perfect, obedient servant. Yet the most powerful lords were not immune to the very betrayals they commanded. In the sweltering summer of 1582, the unthinkable happened. Oda Nobunaga, the most powerful warlord in Japan, the man who had nearly unified the nation, was staying at the Honno-ji temple in Kyoto. He was surrounded by his own men, protected by one of his most trusted generals, Eiichai Mitsuhide. Without warning, Mitsuhide's army surrounded the temple and set it ablaze. Trapped and overwhelmed, Nobunaga was forced to commit suicide. This was not an act of a disgraced Ronin, but a calculated betrayal by a top-ranking samurai at the peak of his power. Eiichai Mitsuhide's motives remain one of history's great puzzles. Some say it was a festering personal insult, a hidden grudge that finally boiled over. Others argue it was pure, ruthless ambition, a chance to seize power for himself in one stunning move. Whatever the reason, his actions shattered the central myth of unwavering loyalty. The man who was supposed to be the ultimate guardian had become the ultimate assassin. This single event proves that the code was a fluid and fragile thing, constantly being weighed against personal ambition, survival, and the volatile tides of politics. A samurai's loyalty was not an unbreakable chain, but a choice made and remade with every sunrise. For every story of a warrior who chose to die with his lord, there is another of one who chose to live for himself. These were the Ronin, the masterless samurai. We often picture them as tragic figures, men cast adrift by the death of their master in battle. But many became Ronin by choice, deliberately cutting the ties of loyalty to seek a better fortune elsewhere. In an era of constant warfare, a skilled warrior was a valuable asset. If a lord was losing a war or was stingy with rewards or simply lacked ambition, a samurai might simply walk away. He would renounce his stipend, leave his post, and become a wave man, a ronin, floating from one domain to another, offering his sword to the highest bidder. This was not always seen as a mark of shame. It was a practical career move in a dangerous world. The famous 47 ronin, so celebrated for their ultimate act of loyalty, were only ronin because their lord was forced to commit seppuku. Their story became legend precisely because such unwavering devotion was the exception, not the rule. For every one of them, there were thousands of other ronin who never sought revenge, who simply adapted and survived in a society that had little place for them. They became bodyguards, mercenaries, even farmers, their katanas a reminder of a life they had willingly left behind. The path of the samurai was never a straight line toward a noble death. It was a winding road full of forks and difficult choices, where the drive for power and the instinct for survival often pulled harder than any abstract code of honor. Behind the polished armor and the stern code of duty lay a relentless and humiliating struggle. The samurai of the Great Peace were not just battling boredom, they were fighting a losing war against poverty. While their social status remained high, their financial reality was often one of quiet desperation. Their entire income was a fixed stipend paid in rice, a system that worked perfectly in a stable agricultural society but became a trap in a growing cash economy. This koku stipend, measured in units of rice, was meant to support the samurai, his family, and his retainers for an entire year. It was a salary set in stone, an amount that rarely changed regardless of the economic climate. Meanwhile, in the bustling castle towns, a new world of merchants and artisans was flourishing, an economy driven by money. The samurai needed cash for everything beyond basic sustenance, from new clothing and furniture to gifts and the social obligations required to maintain his standing. So he was forced to do the unthinkable. He had to convert his rice into currency. This single act made him vulnerable. He became dependent on the very merchant class his code taught him to despise. The rice brokers and moneylenders, officially at the bottom of the social hierarchy, held all the financial power. They could manipulate exchange rates, offer low prices for the samurai's rice, and then lend him money at crushing interest rates when his stipend ran out, which it almost always did. Imagine the indignity, a proud warrior whose ancestors commanded armies, now standing in a merchant's shop, forced to negotiate a loan, his family's well-being held hostage by a man he was supposed to look down upon. This created a deep and corrosive social paradox. The merchant class, ranked below farmers and artisans in the official Confucian order, grew wealthy off the desperation of the warrior elite. A samurai's sword and his name were symbols of honor, but they were worthless at the pawnshop. His most valuable asset was his future rice stipend, which he would often pledge to a merchant as collateral for a loan, sinking him deeper into a cycle of debt that stretched years, even generations, into the future. His entire life became a performance of aristocratic dignity funded by the very people his status was meant to overshadow. How could a man be a moral exemplar, a living symbol of virtue, when he was constantly worried about feeding his household and dodging his creditors? The economic foundation of the samurai class was crumbling beneath the weight of its own ideals, creating a quiet resentment that would one day have explosive consequences. The same hands that wielded a lethal katana were often the very same ones that held a delicate calligraphy brush. This was the dual path, the principle of Bunbu Ryodo, the pen and the sword in accord. For the samurai of the Great Peace, martial skill was only half of their identity. The other half was cultivated in the quiet, rarefied air of the terum or the poetry gathering. These artistic practices were not mere hobbies for the cultured elite. They were rigorous disciplines seen as essential training for the warrior's mind and spirit. The tea ceremony, or chado, was a form of moving meditation. Every gesture was prescribed, from the way the bamboo whisk was held to the precise number of times the tea bowl was turned. This was not about arbitrary rules, but about achieving a state of total presence. A samurai performing the ceremony had to quiet the noise of his thoughts, focus completely on the task at hand, and extend a humble, gracious hospitality to his guests. In that small, rustic terum, the battlefield was forgotten, replaced by a different kind of challenge, mastering one's own impatience and ego. The ultimate goal was to achieve a state of serene alertness, a calm readiness that was, in its essence, no different from the Mushin mind of no mind he sought in swordsmanship. The sudden, startling beauty of a haiku poem served a similar purpose. Composing a perfect verse in just 17 syllables required immense mental discipline. It forced the samurai to observe the world with a sharp, poetic eye, to capture a fleeting moment of insight like the sound of a frog leaping into an old pond. This practice refined his perception, teaching him to find profound meaning in the smallest of details. A warrior who could appreciate the transient beauty of a cherry blossom was better equipped to face the transient nature of his own life without fear. Even the art of flower arranging, ikebana, was a lesson in structure, balance, and asymmetry. A samurai would carefully select each branch and blossom, considering its line, its form, and the empty space around it. He was creating a miniature representation of the natural world, a harmony of forces. This cultivated an aesthetic sense crucial for a leader, an understanding that true strength was not brute force, but a balanced and graceful application of power. How could a man command others if he could not even command the peaceful arrangement of flowers in a vase? These gentle arts were the necessary counterweight to the sword. They polished the spirit, softened the rough edges of a martial life, and provided a channel for the intense focus and discipline that had no other outlet in a time of peace. The ultimate samurai was not a mere killer. He was a complete human being, capable of creating beauty with the same focused intensity he used to destroy his enemies. This cultivated ideal, born from centuries of peace, would become the final, polished image of the samurai that the world would eventually inherit. But for every celebrated warrior standing in the sun, a shadow history runs parallel. While the stories of men and their katanas dominate the legend, another class of fighter guarded the home, the family, and the honor of the clan from the shadows. These were the honor bujeisha, the female samurai, and their existence shatters the modern image of the passive, demure noblewoman. Their world was not the open battlefield, but the last line of defense. When a lord marched to war with his army, his castle and the families within were left dangerously vulnerable. It was the women who remained, and they were trained from a young age not in embroidery, but in the lethal art of the naginata. This was not a sword, but a long, curved blade mounted on a graceful wooden pole. Its design was pure genius for its purpose. A naginata's reach allowed a defender to strike from a distance, keeping an enemy at bay. It could be used to sweep an opponent's legs, to hook their armor, or to deliver a devastating slash, all while its wielder maintained a defensive posture. In the confined, chaotic space of a castle corridor or a besieged courtyard, the naginata was far more practical and deadly than a shorter sword. Training with this weapon was a core part of an aristocratic girl's education, a sobering reminder that her duty might one day require her to kill. The most famous of these warriors emerge from the mists of history like legends. In the epic tale of the hike, we meet Tomo Gozen. She is described as a beauty, but the text quickly pivots to her terrifying prowess. She was a warrior worth 1,000, ready to confront a demon or a god. She fought alongside her lord Minamoto no Yoshinaka, not as a mascot but as a captain. In the final, desperate battle of Awazu, as Yoshinaka's forces were being annihilated, his last command to Tomo was to flee to avoid the shame of dying with a woman beside him. She ignored him. Instead, she rode directly into the heart of the enemy host, singled out a powerful samurai, grappled with him, and cleanly beheaded him, placing the trophy at her lord's feet as a final act of loyalty before she was ultimately forced to disappear from the battlefield, her fate a mystery. Centuries later, as the samurai era was drawing its final breath in the 1860s, another woman would embody this spirit. Her name was Nakano Takiko. During the Boshin War, a conflict between the crumbling shogunate and the new imperial government, she formed an ad hoc unit of female warriors. Knowing the male-dominated army would never officially allow women to fight, she and her band, some as young as 16, charged the imperial lines independently. They fought with such ferocity that the enemy soldiers, astonished and unwilling to dishonor themselves by killing women, were initially hesitant to fire. Nakano Takiko herself was shot and mortally wounded. With her last strength, she asked her sister to cut off her head so it would not be taken as a trophy by the enemy. She died as she lived by the code, her naginata still in her hand. Why are these stories not as well known as those of their male counterparts? The answer lies in the very system that codified Bushido. As the Tokugawa peace solidified, a new, rigid social orthodoxy took hold, one that increasingly confined women to domestic roles. The active, martial role of the Ana Bugeisha was slowly written out of the official narrative, an inconvenient truth that did not fit the new, polished ideal of a woman's place. The naginata was transformed from a weapon of war into a tool for teaching young girls grace, posture, and moral discipline, its bloody history sanitized. The legacy of the female samurai is a testament to the fact that honor and courage were never exclusive to one gender. They were a final, desperate duty, a silent vow to protect everything a warrior left behind. The world the samurai had known for centuries shattered in a single generation. In 1868, a political earthquake called the Meiji Restoration toppled the shogunate and restored the emperor to direct power. Japan, terrified of being colonized by Western powers, launched itself on a frantic race to modernize. The new government looked at the samurai class and saw a dangerous relic, an obstacle to progress. With a series of swift, brutal reforms, they signed the death warrant for Bushido as a legal reality. The new leaders abolished the feudal domains, stripping lords of their lands and the samurai of their local masters. Then came the final, crushing blow, the Heitere Edict of 1876, which made it a crime for a samurai to carry his sword in public. The katana, the very soul of the warrior, was now illegal. His government stipend, his koku, was commuted into a one-time payment of government bonds, which many samurai with no financial experience quickly squandered. In the span of a few years, the entire social and economic structure that had supported the warrior class for 700 years was systematically dismantled. The samurai were now just commoners, their code officially obsolete in the face of a new national motto: Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, rich country, strong army, where modern conscripts with rifles would replace the warrior with his sword. But a code of honor does not vanish with a pen stroke. The final, tragic gasp of the old way came in 1877 in the Satsuma Rebellion. Seigo Takamori, a legendary samurai who had helped forge the new Meiji government, became disillusioned with the speed of westernization and the humiliation of his class. He returned to his home domain and with a force of 40,000 discontented former samurai, raised his banner in revolt. This was not a battle for territory, it was a war for the soul of Japan. On one side stood the Imperial Japanese Army, a modern force of conscripted farmers equipped with state-of-the-art rifles and artillery. On the other stood Seigo's samurai, a warrior elite clad in traditional armor, their primary weapons still the katana and the spear. The clash was a foregone conclusion. The samurai fought with breathtaking courage, charging into gunfire with their familiar battle cries. But their legendary swords were useless against the storm of lead from disciplined rifle lines. Their individual bravery was no match for the cold, industrial efficiency of modern warfare. The rebellion was crushed, wounded and surrounded in his final stand. Seigo Takamori performed seppuku, upheld the code one last time and became a legend. In his death, he cemented a powerful contradiction. The man who died for the ancient way of the samurai was the same man who helped create the modern Japan that destroyed it. The Satsuma Rebellion was more than a military defeat. It was a brutal, symbolic funeral for Bushido. It demonstrated with horrific clarity that the way of the warrior could not survive in a world of machines and mass conscription. The code was dead, but its ghost was just beginning to stir. But the ghost of the samurai was too potent a symbol to remain buried. In the frantic decades that followed the Meiji Restoration, Japan's new leaders faced a crisis of identity. They had ripped the nation from its feudal past, but what would hold it together in the modern world? The answer came from an unexpected place, a deliberate and calculated resurrection of the very code they had just destroyed. Intellectuals and government officials began to sift through the ashes of the samurai era, not to understand its complexity, but to forge a new national myth. They took the philosophical writings of the peaceful Edo period, like the Hagakure, and stripped them of their context. The nuanced, often conflicting ideals of different samurai were hammered into a single, rigid, state-sponsored doctrine. This new Bushido was not about personal honor or spiritual refinement. It was about one thing, and one thing only: absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the divine emperor. The warrior's devotion to his local lord was now transferred to the state itself, with the emperor at its head. This was a radical and dangerous distortion. The code that had once emphasized the warrior's internal moral compass was twisted into an external command, a tool for mass obedience. School textbooks were rewritten to glorify this new version of Bushido. Children were taught stories of fanatical loyalty from a sanitized past, held up as the purest expression of being Japanese. The army and navy adopted this state Bushido as their spiritual foundation. A modern conscript holding a rifle was told he possessed the soul of a samurai. His duty was not to think but to obey, to offer his life willingly for the emperor, just as a retainer would for his lord. This ideology transformed the concept of surrender into the ultimate sin. To be captured alive was a permanent stain on one's honor and on the nation. This thinking culminated in the dreaded battlefield tactics of the Second World War, where soldiers were often ordered into suicidal banzai charges and pilots became kamikaze, divine winds, crashing their planes into enemy ships. These were not the actions of ancient warriors, but the terrible outcome of a modern, weaponized philosophy. The same code that once spoke of mental clarity and artistic cultivation was now used to justify blind fanaticism and imperial conquest. The government sold a romantic vision of the samurai to the people, while using the hollowed-out version of their code to build a ruthless war machine. How did a philosophy born in an era of peace become the engine for one of history's most destructive wars? The legacy of the samurai was no longer their own. It had been stolen and reshaped into a weapon for a modern empire. With the smoke of war cleared and the emperor's divinity renounced, Japan faced its shattered identity. The very concept of Bushido was now toxic, a ghost haunting the ruins it helped create. In the post-war years, the code became a national taboo, a subject too painful and dangerous to discuss. The victorious Allied occupation authorities actively dismantled the state Shinto and ultranationalist ideologies that had fueled the war machine. Bushido, as the spiritual core of that machine, was publicly discredited and cast into exile. It was seen as the philosophical poison that had led the nation into a catastrophic war and justified unspeakable atrocities in the name of the emperor. To speak of the way of the warrior was to invoke the kamikaze, the banzai charges, and the brutal militarism the new Japan was desperate to leave behind. In schools, textbooks were purged of any glorification of the samurai spirit. In public life, people turned away from the past, focusing all their energy on the monumental task of economic rebuilding. The nation collectively agreed to forget, to build a new identity as a pacifist, democratic, and industrial power. Academic historians, for their part, largely ignored Bushido, dismissing it as a modern fabrication with no real historical basis, a clever tool of propaganda that deserved its place on the ash heap of history. The complex, centuries-old evolution of the code was flattened into a single, monstrous caricature. For an entire generation, the samurai ideal was buried, not in a grave of honor, but in a silent, shameful exile. How could a philosophy so deeply woven into the cultural fabric simply vanish? Yet this very act of forgetting created a void, an unanswered question about the nation's soul that would one day call the ghost back from the shadows. The ghost of the samurai did not stay buried for long. From the ashes of post-war shame, it found a new path back into the light, not through political decrees, but through the flickering screens of Hollywood. The 1980s introduced the world to a new kind of hero, one who wielded a katana with a quiet moral certainty. These cinematic samurai were noble loners, fighting for justice with a code that was simple, pure, and utterly divorced from its messy historical roots. The complex realities of peasant massacres and financial desperation were scrubbed away, leaving only a sleek, marketable shell of honor and self-discipline. This was not a revival of history, it was a complete rebranding for a global audience hungry for ancient wisdom. The samurai was no longer a warning from Japan's militarist past, he was a cool, philosophical action star. This sanitized version then exploded into the world of video games. Players could now step into the getter sandals of a wandering swordsman, their journey defined by a clear, binary morality meter. Upholding the code meant helping villagers and fighting evil, a far cry from the historical samurai's role as tax-collecting bureaucrats or enforcers of a brutal social order. The code was gamified, transformed into a simple set of quests and power-ups that rewarded the player for being virtuous. It became a satisfying gameplay loop, not a challenging ethical framework. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurred in the world of business and self-help. Management gurus and leadership coaches looked at Bushido and saw a powerful brand. They repackaged the way of the warrior into a set of principles for the modern corporate samurai. The focus shifted entirely to the most palatable parts of the code: relentless self-discipline, unwavering loyalty to the company, and a mindset for strategic victory. The darker historical pillars, like the glorification of death or the demand for blind obedience, were carefully edited out. You will find no business bestseller titled The Hagakure that advises middle managers to simply choose death when faced with a difficult quarterly report. Instead, the katana becomes a metaphor for cutting through inefficiency, and the Zen mind is a tool for achieving peak productivity. This global repackaging has been incredibly successful, creating a universally recognized icon. But what has been lost in this translation? The modern samurai is a comforting figure, a symbol of control in a chaotic world. We have taken a complex, often contradictory historical reality and polished it into a smooth stone, easy to hold but stripped of its rough, truthful edges. We embraced the discipline but forgot the despair that often fueled it. We adopted the loyalty but ignored the moral compromises it demanded. This rebranding asks a difficult question. Are we seeking the true spirit of the samurai, or are we merely creating a mirror that reflects our own desire for order and purpose? The journey of this code is not over. Its final chapter is now being written in our own collective imagination. That polished stone of modern myth now rests in the hands of historians and archaeologists who are chipping away at its smooth surface to reveal a far more fractured and fascinating truth. The academic world is currently engaged in a quiet revolution, a fundamental reassessment of everything we thought we knew about the samurai code. For decades, the dominant narrative was shaped by the very state propaganda that weaponized Bushido in the early 20th century. Today, scholars are returning to the primary sources, the diaries, the legal documents, and the personal letters of the samurai themselves, and the picture that is emerging is stunningly different. The old idea of a single, unifying Bushido is collapsing under the weight of historical evidence. Instead, researchers are finding a complex tapestry of regional variations, personal interpretations, and constant ethical negotiation. For every samurai who wrote passionately about dying for his lord, there is another who wrote detailed complaints about his rice stipend or his difficult neighbors. These were not philosophical robots, they were human beings navigating a rigid social system, and their personal writings are filled with the same anxieties and practical concerns we would recognize today. One of the most significant shifts in modern scholarship involves the timeline of the code's creation. The romantic notion that Bushido was a timeless, ancient creed has been thoroughly dismantled. Historians like Carl Friday have meticulously demonstrated that the warrior ethos of the early samurai, the bushi, was almost entirely pragmatic, focused on land rights, military success, and personal loyalty, with very little of the later philosophical gloss. The famous texts we associate with Bushido, like the Hagakure, are now understood not as revelations of an eternal truth, but as products of their specific time, written by men who are already nostalgic for a warrior past they barely knew. Archaeology adds another compelling layer to this debate. Excavations of samurai residences from the peaceful Edo period reveal a life far removed from the austere, minimalist ideal. Alongside swords and armor, archaeologists find luxurious imported ceramics, elaborate hair ornaments, and evidence of a sophisticated diet. These material remains tell a story of a warrior class that was deeply engaged in consumer culture and social display, actively participating in the very merchant economy their code supposedly taught them to despise. How do we reconcile the image of a frugal, self-sacrificing warrior with the physical evidence of a man who enjoyed fine Chinese porcelain and lavish entertainment? The answer, scholars now argue, is that we should not even try. The code was always an ideal, a North Star to aspire to, not a description of daily reality. The modern understanding is that Bushido was less a rigid set of rules and more a language for discussing virtue, a flexible framework that samurai used to justify their actions, whether those actions were noble, pragmatic, or entirely self-serving. This new, nuanced perspective does not diminish the samurai, it makes them infinitely more human. It forces us to see them not as icons, but as complex individuals living in a world of conflicting demands, where the lofty ideals of the pen had to constantly compromise with the gritty realities of the sword. So where does this long and twisted journey leave us standing before the ghost of the samurai? The true legacy of Bushido, once we scrub away the state propaganda and the romantic fiction, reveals a set of human principles that are startlingly relevant. This is not about resurrecting a medieval warrior, but about recognizing a timeless struggle for moral character. The core of the samurai ethos in its purest form boils down to a handful of profound virtues. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to act rightly in spite of it. Integrity meant aligning your actions with your inner truth, even when no one was watching. Benevolence was the strength to show compassion, the understanding that true power carries a responsibility to protect. Respect was the acknowledgement of the inherent value in others, from a lord to a peasant. And self-discipline was the daily, grinding work of mastering your own mind and desires. The ultimate lesson of this forgotten history is that the code's highest purpose was never blind loyalty to an external master. That was the distortion, the perversion that led to tragedy. The true value was always an internal revolution, a relentless pursuit of self-mastery. The samurai's real battle was fought within, a war against his own laziness, his own fear, his own ego. This is what makes the philosophy so powerfully applicable today. You do not need a katana to practice this form of Bushido. Your dojo is your daily life. The courage to speak up in a meeting when it would be easier to stay silent, that is modern bravery. The integrity to do the right thing when a shortcut is tempting, that is your moral sword. The self-discipline to put down your phone and focus on a difficult task, that is your mental training. The respect you show to someone you disagree with, that is your courtesy. And the benevolence to extend a hand to a colleague who is struggling, that is your duty to your community. The samurai sought to forge an unshakable character, and that is a quest that transcends time and culture. Their story teaches us that honor is not a title given to you, but a quality you build brick by brick through 1,000 small choices. It is a lifelong practice of polishing your own spirit. The final, enduring truth of the samurai code is not a command to die for a lord, but a challenge to live with purpose, to cultivate a heart that is both strong and kind. This is the forgotten history's greatest gift, an invitation to become the master of your own soul. We have traveled from the polished myth of a single, ancient code to the complex and ever-shifting reality of the samurai spirit. This was not a story carved in stone, but one written and rewritten across centuries, shaped by the raw needs of war, the quiet desperation of peace, and the calculated designs of political power. The true history of Bushido is a tapestry woven with threads of Zen mindfulness, Confucian duty, and Shinto reverence, but it is also frayed by the harsh threads of betrayal, poverty, and moral compromise. To understand this legacy is to embrace a beautiful and difficult truth that history is never a simple legend. It is a living, breathing conversation between our ideals and our human frailties. The samurai's greatest battle was not for glory on a battlefield, but for meaning within their own hearts. Their story challenges us to look beyond the comforting simplicity of myth and to find wisdom in the rich, complicated tapestry of what actually was. So as the ghost of the samurai fades back into the mists of time, a final question turns from history toward you. How will you take the true spirit of this journey, the relentless pursuit of discipline and the unwavering commitment to your own integrity, and apply it to the battles of your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten corners of our past.